So, today I want to talk about how conservatives have planned to overturn Roe v. Wade since the court gave its ruling in 1973. Now, last time I talked about the consequences of Justice Alito's draft and how it will affect the lives of pregnant individuals seeking to terminate their pregnancies once it's made official. Today, I want to talk about these strategies developed by conservatives that brought us to this point so we can see just how the suffering that will manifest was purposefully designed. So, when exploring these strategies that were implemented, we can see at least four major tactics that were employed by these conservatives. Some of these strategies were not born purely out of anti abortion sentiment. However, opposition to abortion and the Roe v. Wade decision were instrumental in the development of all of these strategies. The first of these strategies was a massive propaganda campaign by anti abortion activists, both socially and legally. Second was direct intimidation tactics, which included protests, threats, violence, and terrorist actions against abortion clinics, providers, staff, and patients. The third tactic was a movement to take over local and state legislatures. And the fourth was to stack the courts with conservative justices in the hopes of eventually taking over the Supreme Court. So I will be covering the first two of these tactics in this video and the remaining two in the next video. Now, before we delve into the reactionary post-Roe v. Wade strategy of anti-abortion activists, I want to provide a little context of the history of abortion in the United States so we can better understand why the anti-abortion activists started when they did. Now, believe it or not, abortion was actually fairly common, safe, and legal under any circumstance in the United States up until around the 1820s. That is, of course, unless you were an enslaved black woman, in which case your bodily autonomy was determined by white slave owners. That said, even with the first laws in the early 19th century specifically pertaining to abortion, midwives and nurses relied on the British common law standard of quickening to determine both the legality and the taboo of an abortion. This quickening was considered the moment when the fetus first moved and kicked, and it is at this moment that it was recognized as a child. So this was considered a highly subjective moment, and it occurred around 4 to 5 months into pregnancy. The penalty for abortion was only a misdemeanor, was not taken as a serious crime, especially by the pregnant individual, and usually only applied to the abortion provider. Now, it's also worth noting that before that quickening period, nobody, not even the Catholic Church, believed that a child was alive. And we can actually see a lot of examples where this was just something that was commonly discussed. These are clippings from newspapers on screen that are talking about, quote, female monthly pills prepared by multiple female physicians, usually considered midwives or nurses, such as Madame Costello. And these pills were provided in order to regulate menstrual cycles, but also to induce abortions. And this was just commonly put into newspapers all of the time. This is how common we had abortion talked about in the United States at one time. So, what happened that changed the legal framework for abortion? Well, ironically enough, it was the American Medical Association in the 1840s, a group composed almost exclusively of men, who asserted themselves into the discussion and tried to replace midwives and nurses who were seen as rivals for business and medical care. We can actually see that around the 1840s, we get this shift into this kind of demonization of abortion, where one Madame Restell, whose clipping was in the previous thing that I showed, basically was demonized for being, quote, the female abortionist. And it's around this time, this clip comes out of 1847, where the AMA physicians were starting to argue that they knew more about when life began. And through their propaganda campaigns and eventually criminalization campaigns that were put forth by the state, most states banned abortion by the 1880s at the request of the AMA. Social stigma had been applied to it throughout, And by 1910, abortion was actually illegal nationally throughout the United States, unless it was deemed necessary by a physician, of course, an AMA physician, to save their patient's life. When you add to this the xenophobic, racist, and quite frankly, eugenics based policies of wealthier white men who funded programs and laws designed to force their wives to have children in order to increase the white population, while simultaneously advocating for policies that limited the pregnancies of women of color, immigrants, and this included tactics up to and including forced hysterectomies. We see this kind of prevailing state sanctioned and legal attitude towards abortion up until at least the 1960s. And this was a choice that was taken away from pregnant individuals. And this was in favor of the desires of a white patriarchal society. This, of course, does not mean that some people didn't take matters into their own hands, and that abortion by choice didn't take place during the early 20th century. In fact, the practice never stopped. It just was hidden underground. And while I do not have the time in this video to go into the full details of the feminist movement and its battles for abortion rights, it is sufficient to say that groups across the 20th century, like the Jane Collective, led the way throughout, providing abortions despite legality, often at great risk to themselves. Coupled with protest, activism, and riots, many states began to offer liberal compromises of legality under certain circumstances by the late 1960s into the early 1970s. It is in reaction to this that the modern anti-abortion movement was born. Now, it started as a subsection of the Catholic Church, known as the Right to Life League, and they fought local battles against state abortion laws. And they were generally considered unsuccessful in those attempts. However, when the Roe v. Wade decision was made in 1973, effectively making abortion legal under specific circumstances, the Right to Life League formed its own entity as a reaction to the decision known as the National Right to Life Committee. This organization actually left its specifically Catholic roots behind in order to try to spread the anti-abortion message to other religious organizations and to move towards a more national platform. And this is when we really see the anti-abortion movement form. It is almost exclusively in reaction to Roe that we see it take this national and center-focused stage. And despite different organizations forming over the years, their tactics have all been rather similar. Rather than trace these specific organizations and their histories, I'd like to return to talking about the tactics of these groups. Since I'm giving a history of these tactics, most of what I'm going to say will be in the past tense. That said, I need it known that most, if not all of these tactics, continue and have gotten only more intense in the present day. So these tactics start with propaganda campaigns. These campaigns were centered around the concept of the fetus having a right to life, while leaving the pregnant individual and their fate almost entirely out of the narrative. By framing it this way, they could make themselves seem like, instead of blaming the pregnant individual for their misconduct, which had been the historic tactic of shaming, these organizations reframe the argument as one that actually placed the blame on feminists for being the murderers of potential life. They tried to position themselves as a civil rights movement, boldly comparing abortions to the Holocaust, comparing it to the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, and generally just victimizing both themselves and this pack of cells known as a fetus. Additionally, they used pictures, models, and toys of fetuses that inaccurately looked exaggeratingly human, and later they would use ultrasounds for a similar purpose of shame tactics, in order to convince people that these groupings of cells were in fact a, quote, unborn child, and it was their attempt to try to make this fetus and a legally defined person who could not advocate for itself, something that's both unfounded in history, as we saw with the quickenings, and in medicine. Now, as time passed, Some of the organizations would actually begin to create this false sense of care about the well-being of the pregnant individual. These organizations would create false narratives about how receiving an abortion would cause permanent physical harm as well as psychological damage in a form of this fictitious PTSD that has been largely debunked by science. Meanwhile, all evidence seems to point to abortions being a safe medical procedure, and it's shown that being denied access to abortion is actually what causes more trauma. And we see this from the APA, who talks about rigorous long term psychological research demonstrates clearly that people who are denied abortions are more likely to experience higher levels of anxiety, lower life satisfaction, and lower self esteem compared with those who are able to obtain abortions. In addition, there is no research to indicate that abortion is the cause for subsequent mental health diagnoses. So, as we can see, a lot of these tactics are using shame, guilt, and fictitious fake medical diagnoses in order to attempt to frame themselves as morally correct. And this framing allows the abortion groups to appear as both the protector of the patient and the child. And in an attempt to impose this framing onto patients against the patient's own needs and desires, they all pursue these tactics not just socially, but legally. And they got the state to enforce their self proclaimed benevolence onto people. So, in the meantime, from the political side of things, the Republican Party began to pick up the anti abortion stance. At first, this was to bring over former Democratic Catholics. However, by 1976, they had actually platformed anti abortion for the first time and generally never looked back. Conservatives had pushed for the Hyde Amendment, which barred federal money from being spent on abortion despite its legality. And in addition to this, the propaganda tactics had spread to the evangelical Christians, who would eventually become the base of the Republican Party. They worked both federally and locally to try to use state power to try to restrict abortion through legal means. This meant pushing for laws that would create extended wait times, often to make it so that people were provided with what they defined as, quote, informed consent, which usually required patients to be given the types of social propaganda that the evangelical groups had created as a requirement of the state. Now, other laws required patients to get permission from spouses, which was later deemed unconstitutional, but as I can assure you, it still happens in certain instances for certain people trying to get medical procedures. Or in the case of minors, permission from parents would be required, which still remains legal to this day. Still, other laws targeted clinics and forced them to comply with unrealistic and unnecessary standards in order to either spend more money or force them to shut down, thus decreasing the amount of clinics in a state and extending the distance needed to be traveled by patients. Meanwhile, these same groups would set up crisis pregnancy centers to replace those facilities, where they would coerce people to not get abortions through similar guilt-tripping strategies. Now, all of these laws were created expressly to slow down a process that's already on a timer, in order to delay it past legal limits or to force people to look at these shaming and guilt-ridden materials filled with inaccurate information, in the desire for them to be able to manipulate and change people's minds. And as violent and manipulative as we can recognize those tactics were, the second tactic of these anti abortion groups was to directly intimidate abortion clinics through protest tactics, threats, violence, and terrorist actions. All of these were used against clinics, providers, staff, and patients. The most notorious of these groups that were using these particular tactics was Operation Rescue. It was also known as Operation Save America. There was something to do with a name change that they went through, but irrelevant of their name, it was them who famously created wanted posters of doctors and doxed them. We can see an example of this now on screen, where we see that you have a Dr. George Tiller, aliases Tiller the Killer, Dr. Death, George the Terrible, wanted by God, for God is not willing that any should perish, but that George Tiller would repent and ask Jesus Christ in his heart. And they put a reward here. And so the thing is even though they were not specifically calling for this doctor to be, quote, killed, by putting a reward like that, they kind of made it obvious that they were trying to get some doctors to be killed. And as a matter of fact, this is exactly what happened. We can see that anti-abortion protesters actually shot and killed a doctor during a demonstration. And this was in 1993, where we see that this doctor was killed at a demonstration outside of the clinic on that day. The person surrendered to police officers, and the slaying was considered the first kind of in the nation. The doctor, David Gunn, was actually shot several times after he got out of his car and approached the unmarked rear entrance of the Women's Medical Service Clinic in Pensacola, which he had opened the same year. The 47-year-old doctor, who performed abortions at several clinics in Florida and other southeastern states, died about 2 hours later in surgery at Sacred Heart Hospital. So yeah, these are the type of tactics that we saw, where they put these posters out and some people would answer the call, despite the fact that the posters themselves gave them some terms of plausible deniability. So in terms of protest tactics, these organizations would also form blockades outside of clinics and intimidate, threaten, and assault patients and staff, both verbally and physically, before they could get in the door, all in the name of rescuing fetuses. In some instances, organizations would actually break into clinics and occupy the facility in order to prevent its operation, effectively denying medical care to patients throughout entire days. Some clinics actually shut down from the constant threats and violence, especially as members of various anti-abortion groups bombed buildings, committed arson, threatened the lives of people associated with clinics, and even brought these protests and threats to the homes of staff and doctors. Now, we can see an example where Vox put out that since 1977, there have been 8 murders, 17 attempted murders, 42 bombings, and 186 arsons targeted at abortion clinics and providers across the United States. In some cases, a small group of clinics have been targeted multiple times. For instance, American Family Planning of Pensacola, which we saw, has experienced at least 5 separate attacks on its premises since 1984, and as recently as 2012. In 1984, the clinic underwent 2 bomb attacks in the span of 6 months, with the first attack forcing the clinic to relocate its offices because the damages were so extensive. Similarly, in Everett, Washington, the branch of the Feminist Women's Health Center experienced 3 arson attacks from 1983 to 1984, and was forced to close its doors a year after it opened, because the cost of repairs were so prohibitive. And so I want to point out that even though I generally don't see property damage as a form of violence, in this case, I actually do think that this is a form of violence. By committing these acts of arson, by bombing these facilities, it wasn't really done in a way that, first of all, was done to protect life. It was very indiscriminate attacks. But secondly, these specifically targeted places that provided medical care and were able to provide support for people. And by destroying the facilities themselves, you actually destroyed the means of medical care for a lot of people, which led to more harm and more death in the long run, and more dangerous circumstances for more people. And so while, again, I don't consider property damage violence, I do have to call out that I recognize these as a form of violence. We see here also from the Washington Post in an article in 1993 that one of the many tactics of anti-abortion groups was concerted campaigns to prevent a doctor from performing abortions. Snidel 47, who has performed abortions at clinics in Melbourne and Orlando, Florida, has been followed repeatedly. His car windows have been smashed. His home and private medical offices have been picketed. Wanted posters featuring a $1,000 reward for information leading to his arrest or the revocation of his medical license have been circulated widely in Central Florida. The posters have also listed his mother's address and phone number, as well as his license plate of his two ex-girlfriends' cars. The children of one of the former girlfriends, he said, were taunted by protesters as they waited for a school bus. So much for pro-life and for wanting to take care of children. Now, the abortion rights advocates and physicians groups, including the AMA, say increasingly the number of doctors around the country that are targets of aggressive campaigns to stop them from performing abortions have increased. The site of the protests have shifted from the clinics, where most of the nation's 1.6 million abortions are performed annually, to the homes of doctors who perform them. And we also have a table that is showing off the amount of disruption statistics, including things like anthrax threats, assault and battery, deaths, kidnappings, burglaries, stalkings, emails, harassing, and these are just the ones that were able to be taken in by the NAF. We see these totals go all the way through 2009. And it's unlikely that any of this has stopped, but the actual number of incidents like these are actually probably much higher. Now, as an aside to all of this, I also need to mention that these doctors were not given the immediate care and recognition that members of the Supreme Court received recently when we were reminded that protest outside of the homes of judges is illegal, and that the Senate immediately passed legislation protecting the families of the Supreme Court, which was later passed by the House. Now, as a matter of fact, many clinics didn't receive any significant aid or assistance from law enforcement when these attacks would occur, as in most cases, law enforcement unsurprisingly took the side of anti-abortion activists. So while in summary, these have been the types of tactics that anti-abortion activists have used to garner support and sympathy while at the same time committing coordinated attacks on clinics. So with that in mind, I hope you'll join me next time as we talk about the other two main tactics that were used to support these anti-abortion activists, namely the state takeovers of legislatures and the takeover of the courts by conservatives. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched today, please do consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord. Now, if you are in the financial place to do so, and only if you're in the financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be contested and demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchistara. Thank you for watching.